Hello, and welcome to the 2019-2020 Corn Export Cargo Quality Report. This is the U.S. Grains Council's 9th year in putting out the Corn Export Cargo Quality Report. We do this report as a means to provide quality, reliability, and transparency of information to our customers abroad. We do a harvest quality report that comes out at harvest time, or and we take grades at the first point of sale. And this here is the export cargo report, which comes out in April every year. And in this report, we're taking grades at point of export. So we're looking at point of harvest, and then we're letting it go through the U.S. export system. And then get to the export cargo report. And during the time through the export system, we see a lot of mechanical damage on the corn, some breaking, some cracking, some things like that happens just throughout the process of elevation. So we need to test it at both points so we really understand what we're working with. Again, this is our 9th year doing this. All of these are on our website. That's www.grains.org. Again, we started in the 2011-2012 crop year, and this year is the 2019-2020 crop year. When we do this report, some of you may be familiar, others may not be, but we look at export catchment areas. And the export catchment areas are essentially areas where the corn is grown and stored. They have sort of natural flows to export. So when you look at Kansas, parts of Nebraska, Missouri, and Iowa, a lot of that flows through the rail system down to our biggest trade partner for feed grains, which is Mexico. And then you look at the Gulf region, that green region there, and that is all connected to the river system, which then goes down to New Orleans and out for export. And then you look at the P&W, or Pacific Northwest catchment area, which is western Iowa and Minnesota, all through the Dakotas and Nebraska, which takes some of the rail lines as well as hooking up with some of the river system over there to go into the export channels and out the West Coast to some of our Asian customers. So we took 430 export samples from these export catchment areas, or ECAs, and these ECAs represent about 90% of U.S. corn exports. So it's a fairly representative sample. When we look at the factors that we tested our grade factors, which is test weight, broken corn foreign material, or BCFM, you'll hear me call it throughout the presentation, total damage, and then heat damage. Another thing that commonly goes with grade factors, but it's not a grade factor itself, is moisture. We will be looking at the moisture of the grain. Next, we'll move to physical factors, and that's stress cracks, your 100 kernel weight, looking at volume and density, and then the whole kernel percentage, as well as looking at the percentage of grain that is a hard endosperm corn. And then we'll look at a chemical composition, which is the makeup of protein, starch, and oil within the grain. And then lastly, we'll look at mycotoxins, which is Aflatoxin, DON, or Vomitoxin as it's known. And then this is the first year that we added a Fumonisin test. So certainly happy to add that Fumonisin test for our international customers who requested it. So when we look at our highlights, the overall crop was just slightly over number 2 for BCFM, which is, I think, better than a lot of us anticipated it. And we can talk about that in more detail here shortly. The other grade factors looked at number 1 or better. So, the U.S. grain system worked very well this year. BCFM, a small issue, but really not as big of an issue as we thought it was going to be. Test weight was a bit lower this year. Total damage was a bit higher, but again, number 1 or better on the damage side. And moisture looks about the same, roughly at 14.5 is what we see at export. The chemical composition, looking at a little bit lower protein and starch, and then oil remaining roughly the same. And then our physical factors, we did have some higher stress cracks, and again, test weight's lower, so your 100 kernel weight is likely going to come in lower, making a lower true density and we also saw lower whole kernels as well, related to our higher BCFM. As far as mycotoxins are concerned, 99.8% of samples were below the FDA action level for aflatoxin. And then again, 100% of samples below the FDA level of DAWN of 5 parts per million, and then 93.3% of samples below the FDA Fumonisin guidance level of 5 parts per million. So mycotoxins, not a huge concern when it comes to whole grain. We can talk a bit about distillers grains. You may have a bit of an issue there. However, at the same time, we can talk about a lot of the things that ethanol plants do to try to mitigate any kind of mycotoxin issues coming out in their DDG. But we'll discuss that here shortly. Looking at grade factors and moisture first, here's a quick table that shows US number 1 through number 5. So just want to remind everyone that if the grade or the grade factor does not meet the minimum or the maximum limit, then it would not meet that grade number. And it has to meet every single grade factor. So for instance, if every grade factor meets quality of number 2, except your heat damage is above 0.2%, that would then become number 3 or number 4 or wherever the heat damage lies. So essentially, the grade is only as strong as the weakest link, in that whatever grade factor comes in the worst would be the grade that your corn receives. So this is a table illustrating all of the data that we took. So test weight coming out, a min of 50.4 and a max of 60.1. I would say the minimum of 50.4 is actually quite good, considering we saw some very low test weight corn coming out in the harvest report when we had that release back in January. BCFM, max BCFM, we saw some 7.0 come out, but again, these are maximum levels. We really do want to focus on the averages when it comes to a lot of these. So again, test weight, the average was 57, which is number 1 grain. BCFM 3.1, which is just over number 2 on the average. But you'll see a lot of that came out of the P&W, where we do have some customers who do buy number 3 grain. Total damage 2.9. Heat damage we rarely see, so average of 0, and moisture right at 14.5, which is where US grain is generally merchandised in the international channels. So when we look at test weight, just like in the harvest report, we saw our biggest issues in the P&W or Pacific Northwest catchment area. We had a 53.9 average there. No real issues coming out of the Gulf, nor out of our southern rail area, both very high test corn coming out for export there. The overall average, we did see 56.8 total average, certainly lower than our past 5-year average of 57.4. But at the same time, 73.1% of the grain that came out was a number 1 grade. And that said, the 54 that's coming out of the Pacific Northwest, if we go back and look at our table here, that 54 is still going to be sort of just below the number 2 range. You're going to be at 53.9 right in here, which again is some of our customers in that area do buy number 3 corn. So despite having a low test weight, we're still making grade for the shipments that are going out into export. They're still making the number 2 or number 3 grade as specified in contract. So here's the test weight, just presented in a metric scale, just a simple conversion to kilograms per hectoliter rather than pounds per bushel. So when we look at broken corn and foreign material, just want to remind everyone how we measure that. We first put the grain through the first sieve, which is 12/64 inches. Anything that passes through that and lands in our second sieve, that is half the size, that would be considered broken corn. Anything that is not corn that remains in the top sieve would be considered foreign material. So anything here that's not corn that you see, that would be foreign material. And then anything that's able to slip down through the 6/64 inch sieve would also be classified as FM. We call this fines or fine material, and this would also go into the FM calculation of the BCFM. So when we look at BCFM, we see again, the primary concern was in the Pacific Northwest. We saw a lot of artificial drying during harvest, which led us to have a 3.8% average. It led us to have some stress cracks, which then went on to cause some more brittle grain through the handling system, which caused a little bit higher BCFM level there coming out of the P&W. That said, again, still making grade for number 3 shipments. We're still able to make grade on all shipments as contract specified. And then when we look at our Gulf area and our Southern Rail area, that's number 2 corn. So we were able to make grade for a lot of the number 2 shipments that come out of this region here in Southern Rail and Gulf. Again, it's a testament to our elevator operators throughout the U.S. that we're able to manage this, and we're able to get acceptable grain going through the export channels. There were huge concerns going into this year that we might not be able to provide the highest quality grain throughout the year when it came to BCFM, but that's just simply not the case. Once again, the U.S. system was able to prevail and help when we had years where the weather just really didn't cooperate and really didn't allow us to have grain that was conducive to maintaining its form throughout the export system. But again, our folks at all the co-ops throughout the U.S. and at all the grain companies throughout the U.S. and all the agribusinesses were really able to maintain the quality of their product and get an acceptable or produce acceptable shipments to go around the world. It's really incredible. And I think it shows, in years to come, when we may have years where the weather doesn't cooperate and we might have some concerns, I think, we all need to look back at this and remember that we were able to manage it in a year of what some might consider a weather crisis. So when we look at our harvest versus export cargo report, we like to compare the 2 reports and look at just exactly how much we increased between the harvest report and the cargo report. Now, we're up just slightly on average for BCFM, but I do want to look at the difference here between our harvest report of last year and our harvest report of this year. We were up, roughly 145%, 140% from 0.7 to 1.0 coming off of harvest, but we didn't see near that jump at all coming into our export cargo report. So again, a wonderful job of managing this when they did get some grain that perhaps wasn't as favorable to storage and handling. So when I look at whole kernels, we have the same illustration that we had from the BCFM measurement, but the only difference in whole kernels is that these kernels here that have small chips in them, although they do not fall through the first sieve and are not technically broken corn, they would not be considered whole kernels because of the small chips. These here that have no chips would be considered whole kernels. So that's what we're looking at. Obviously, much lower whole kernels year over year. That's definitely related to the brittleness of the corn and certainly related to a slightly higher BCFM. But because whole kernels do not show up in grade factors and are rarely, if ever, contracted, nor do they really affect performance in a major way, it's certainly manageable for us to continue to meet contract specs. When we look at our whole kernel difference, we certainly did see a considerable drop off from 90.8 down to 77.4. So again, while we were dealt a little bit more brittle grain, this is certainly expected, but because of some techniques and strategies, we were able to keep the whole kernels, while the chipped kernels, while not whole kernels, we were able to keep them from becoming broken corn and a part of BCFM, which can really affect performance. So we look at total damage. Damage was actually lower coming out of the P&W on this one, and highest coming out of the Gulf. So on average, 2.9, certainly a bit higher than we've seen in the past. But again, 91% came out number 2 grade. Didn't have really too many issues with damage this year coming out for export. So when we look at our increase in damage, again, very small increase this year. That's people understanding that they had a job to do, and they had a very, very small window to be able to make grade from 2.7, trying to stay under 3.0. So certainly, again, another very good job by the elevator operators around the country in keeping damage low and keeping the difference between harvest and export minimal. Heat damage, rarely do we have heat damage problems coming out into the export channels. Heat damage tends to be something that is managed internally within the US. It's very, very difficult to blend and put into shipments. So it's something that tends to be contracted at a discount to domestic millers, and really does stay out of the international channel. So well, again, it's 0% heat damage. It's number 1 grade. We haven't had any issues with heat damage really in the past. It's something we will continue to manage since it is a grade factor, something that's very sensitive, but at the same time, really no issues when it comes to the export channel. Moisture, we did have a higher moisture year at harvest, but we did dry down to make our 14.5% moisture grade that we merchandise in the export channels. So if you look here, we did have the moistest harvest on record in the Grains Council's reporting history, and then back down to 14.5. So this 3% reduction in moisture is what caused those stress cracks, and it's what caused the brittleness of the grain, which is why we did see a little bit higher BCFM and lower whole kernels. So that, yes, that does a great job in illustrating the amazing drying that had to occur this year due to weather issues and folks having to harvest a little bit, or having a shorter season than they would have liked. Now we're going to move on to chemical composition. Again, this is talking about protein, starch, and oil. Looking at protein, it's important for poultry and livestock feeding. Depending on how you value your corn, it can supply some essential amino acids in those diets. It's influenced by the genetics of the grain, the weather, and then just the available nitrogen during the growing season. Anyone who grows wheat understands maybe some nitrogen providing some protein into your grain. Looking at starch, that's going to be important for your wet millers, folks in the corn gluten industry, and then also your dry grind ethanol manufacturers. So looking at starch, is king when it comes to the breeding that's going on in the U.S. It's primarily been geared toward our ethanol folks, since that's where 40% of our crop goes. Then oil, it's a great byproduct from our wet and dry milling. So whether that's distiller's corn oil that goes into some feed, or any kind of byproduct coming from the wet milling side, it can be an essential feed component, provide some great pigment to the feed if you're working with layers. Many things that oil can certainly do, and this is going to be genetics, weather, and yield as well. So we look at our chemical composition, just really want to focus on the average since these ranges are fairly tight. Protein right here at 8.3%, starch at 72.2%, and oil right at 4%. So protein a bit lower this year. I think some of that is going to be due to some of the intense moisture that we had. Had a little bit lower protein. If you look back at 12-13 when we had that drought, that's when we saw a spike in protein due to some of the lower yields and more available nitrogen per ear of corn. Then we look at starch, we saw a big drop off in 15-16, but since then been fairly consistent, hovering just over 72% starch. The drop, frankly, I'm unsure what happened here. Probably something worth exploring, but just fairly even across the country, right around 72%. And then oil, a little bit higher than the average, but we've seen roughly the same 4% oil since 2014-15 when we started at 3.9, but certainly up above the average over the past 9 years of taking this data. So now we'll move on to physical factors. Certainly important, but the physical factors I think tell us a bit more in the harvest report, give us a bit more forbearing for the export cargo report, but still worth sharing with you all. So the physical factors we'll look at are the horniest and hard endosperm. We already talked about the whole kernels. Again, not a grade factor, as I mentioned earlier, but we did discuss it since it goes kind of hand in hand with BCFM. We'll look at kernel weight, volume, and density, and then we'll look at stress cracks and the stress crack index. The stress crack index is something we run on a regression since it is so closely related to stress cracks. So when we look at our physical factors, stress crack percentage, we did have a fairly large standard deviation here. So I do want to highlight how big that range was from 0 to 47% with an average of 11, certainly higher than we've seen in the past. 100 kernel weight also quite variable, I would say, but the average down a little bit this year related as well to our lower test weight. Kernel volume right at 0.28, which is roughly the same that we've seen. And then when we divide kernel weight by kernel volume, we get our true density, which is lower than we've seen in the past. Whole kernels, again, we covered this, lower than we've seen in the past, but also do want to point out the very large range and the large standard deviation. So very variable crop when it came to whole kernels and as well BCFM subsequently. Horniest endosperm, right in the range we've seen in the past, right at 81. So looking at stress cracks, these are internal cracks in the hard endosperm of the corn. Most common cause is artificial drying. So again, we saw more artificial drying this year, so we certainly saw some more stress cracks as well. The main thing we look at is it really impacts the breakage susceptibility because in the U.S. export system, there's a possibility the grain could be elevated 6, 7, 8 times by the time it hits a boat to head out to export. And during that time, there is quite a bit of damage or breakage the grain can experience. And so these cracks sort of act as a precursor to that breakage. So without the cracks, the grain is much sturdier. With it, it tends to explode on impact once it's elevated. We look at our stress cracks, certainly not as bad as we have seen in the past. However, we did see more than we've seen since 2014-15. So certainly have a higher breakage susceptibility than our 5-year average of 8%. So again, this is related to BCFM very highly. Just like BCFM, we see just a very, very small increase, smaller increase than we've seen in past years. For instance, a year like this, where we had the same stress crack percentage coming into the harvest report, we gained 7% through the export channel. So this year, our folks were really able to take great care of some grain that came in with one of the highest stress crack percentages we had seen. So looking at stress crack index, I'm going to briefly explain this. Stress crack index essentially is a weighted addition of looking at stress cracks. So it takes into account the severity of the cracking. So if you have one kernel that has one stress crack in it, you would multiply that by 1. If you have kernels that have 2 stress cracks in them, you would multiply them by 3. And then any kernel that has 2 or 3 or greater than 2 stress cracks, you would multiply by 5. You would add that up and you would get a stress crack index. The reason we don't measure it is because it was costing a bit of money. And so we decided to take it out so we could include the Fumonisin testing, which was much more requested. Now, that said, we did notice that there was a very, very tight correlation between stress cracks and stress crack index. So we saw a 93.64% correlation between stress cracks and stress crack index. So this year, we were able to to plug in, if you plug in X here, you'll get a stress crack index of 29.3. So you'd come in somewhere right around there this year at 29.3. So we'd have a stress cracks of 11% and bring that up and hit the regression line. Looking at kernel weight, volume, and density, we did see a lower kernel weight just because of the lower test weight, and then kernel volume is roughly the same that we've seen. So we did see a lower density this year. So we saw some softer kernels that should be less at risk for development of stress cracks if high drying temperatures is employed. Be better for wet milling and feed use. That said, it certainly was an interesting year, and I'm not sure necessarily we can say that this grain was less at risk for stress cracks. Perhaps some of the shorter season varieties that some of the guys planted in some of their regions, perhaps that grain was a bit better at withstanding some high temperature drying, and it did help with the stress cracks. However, we still did see very high stress cracks coming off at harvest. So I really think the lower true density is just primarily due to a lower test weight grain. So we look at our 100 kernel weight. We see the biggest struggles in the Pacific Northwest area, with our other ones coming in above average. So 36.8 would be above any average year in the past, and 36.2 also would be above any average year in the past, with a lot of our issues, again, concentrated in the Pacific Northwest, where in that catchment area, they really had a lot of weather struggles and were unable to produce a crop with a high test weight. Kernel volume, again, we're right on par here at 0.28 on the national average, with very little variance around the country. So when we do the equation, again, we're just dividing 100 kernel weight by kernel volume and getting our true density. Had a lower true density than we've seen in the past. Unsure, but perhaps due to the varieties that some folks planted, preparing for having a shorter season. Hornius endosperm, very little variation over the years. This would just be due to the type of grain that folks planted. So kind of right in the 5-year average at 81%. So now we're going to take a look at mycotoxins, looking at aflatoxin, DON, and fumonisin. So I just want to read this. This mycotoxin testing provides an assessment of the presence of aflatoxin, DON, and fumonisin in U.S. corn as it reaches export points early in the marketing year. 431 export cargo samples were tested for aflatoxin, 180 samples tested for DON and fumonisin. Reports only the frequency of detected elevated levels of mycotoxin in export samples. So that's all this report does. It doesn't tell you how to formulate buying decisions surrounding mycotoxins. It just lets you know what we're seeing when we conduct these tests at export. We look at our positive results if we're above the lower conformance level, which for aflatoxin is 5 parts per billion, and for DON and fumonisin is 0.5 parts per million. So here are the suggested levels by the FDA. That's the Food and Drug Administration here in the U.S. When it comes to diets for animals. You look at dairy animals being some of the most sensitive. They're at 20 parts per billion. And then breeding cattle and swine and poultry are a little less sensitive, with finishing beef cattle being the least sensitive. That said, in the U.S., grain does not and will not be exported from the U.S. Should it be over 20 parts per billion. That is part of the law. It's something that FGIS signs on, FGIS being the Federal Grain Inspection Service. So it's not something that you will see on any shipments coming out of the U.S. Now, that said, we did see one sample that did go above 20 parts per billion, and it was the final sample in the survey. Something to remember, the grade on the sample as it went out for shipment was 11 parts per billion. and then it tested at 23 parts per billion during our independent survey, which happened about a month later. So there are some reasons that it could have been above 20 parts per billion, and they would be built into the way the report is taken. So it either happened in storage, or it could also be due to high variability of mycotoxin testing. So you could take 3 or 4 samples from the same cargo and get slightly different results, and that also is a possibility. So we did see one over 20 parts per billion, but again, it did not go out with that grade, nor would it be acceptable to ship had it tested over 20 parts per billion the day of shipment. When we look at our historical aflatoxin results, again, in the 9 years doing this, this is the only sample we've had over 20 parts per billion, and it is part of the manner in which we take these tests. Aflatoxin tends to be something that is produced in drought years. So when we look at 2012, 2013, we do see a little bit more aflatoxin than we have in the past, as well as 16, 17, we saw a bit more because of a little bit drier weather. But this year, really no issues when it comes to aflatoxin. So comparing the harvest and export cargo report just to see how much of it develops during storage. Again, we see a pretty good job done by elevator managers around the country. We see it year in, year out in their ability to manage aflatoxin. So now looking at vomitoxin, or DON, swine being the most sensitive to DON, right there at 5 parts per million, and then ruminating beef and dairy cattle older than 4 months right there at 10 parts per million, and then chickens as well, less than 50% of their, or anything less than or equal to 50% of their diet and less than 10 parts per million is acceptable. That said, I really want to encourage everyone, when you look into these limits, whether you follow the US FDA guidelines or the guidelines in your country, please look at the quantity of feed that you can put in at these levels into the diets. So quite often, there are abilities to feed things that might have some mycotoxins in them, just at a lower inclusion rate. So certainly keep that in mind as you buy products. But the main thing is, when you receive products, please test everything that you receive, because if you get something, there is the responsibility of feeding the animal is on your operation, and you have to know exactly what you have when it arrives at your facility and you feed it to your animals. It's very, very important that you test all of your cargoes for mycotoxins. When we look at our DON test results, we divided it into 4 categories. So we divided it into a category right here, which would be just above the lower conformance level, or yielding a positive test at 0.5 parts per million. Then we have this area here, which is 0.5 to 1.9, and then we have 2 to 5, and then we have greater than 5. So at greater than 5, this is where we would consider whole grain having an issue, including into certain diets. And we didn't see any of our whole grain be over 5 parts per million upon export. So that's certainly promising news, shows that we can feed the whole grain that's coming out of the U.S. to animals with little concern. We saw a few samples come in at the 2 to 5. I believe that's one sample there that came in the 2 to 5 range. And then we had quite a few samples come in the 0.5 to 1.9 range. Now, the reason we divided them into these segments is to understand exactly what we're looking at when it comes to mycotoxins in distillers grains. So as many people know, distillers grains, during the process of making distillers grains, the mycotoxin levels triple. So you bring in 1 ton of corn, and every ton of corn makes, it takes roughly 2.8 tons of corn to make 1 ton of DDG, which then would translate to roughly a tripling in the mycotoxin levels, since they do not filter out during the process. So that said, there are likely some some bushels of corn in here that might be of concern when it comes to distillers grains. So that's kind of what we were measuring going looking at these different groupings. Now, despite the fact that we may have some grain that might be concerned for distillers grains, our ethanol plants in the United States test every load that comes in because they do understand the sensitivity. Every load of corn that comes into their ethanol plant, they test because they do understand the sensitivity in shipping DDGs with any kind of mycotoxins, and they understand how critical it is to not ship any DDG with an elevated level of mycotoxins. So despite the fact that you may see some grain that could test, could lead to high mycotoxins in DDG, the ethanol plants in the US have done a magnificent job in managing that and ensuring that shipments that go out have low levels of mycotoxins. So when we look at our historical vomitoxin results, this year was a little bit higher in the vomitoxin area, particularly when we look at this range of 0.5 to 1.9. The only other year that would rival that would have been 16-17, where we saw some major issues in that realm. But again, whole grain really not a big issue, and not even a huge concern in the 2 to 5 range. So just a little bit of concern here in the 0.5 to 1.9 range. But I can't stress it enough. Please do test all of your products that come into your feed mill or your operation so that you know exactly what you have. I had a nutritionist once tell me, you get results on what you inspect and not what you expect. So certainly be sure to inspect all of your cargoes so that you get exactly what you need in the performance out of your animals and your operation. So looking at the harvest versus the cargo report, saw a reduction in DON levels going through the channel. So I think that's a common theme year over year. So something that's not terribly different, but again, right on par for the course to see a little reduction there. Fumonisin levels, 0.5 parts per million is our lower conformance level. Swine and catfish are sort of the major animals that would start here at the FDA guidance level of 20 parts per million. Breeding ruminants and poultry at 30, ruminants greater than 3-month-old for slaughter is 60, and then poultry is 100. And look here, you have 50% of the diet, 50% of the diet. So do look at the guidelines that you follow to make sure that you understand exactly the quantity of the diet that you can include at these mycotoxin levels. So this is our first year to include the Fumonisin testing results. So we don't have anything to compare it to in the past. We did have 93.3% of samples test below the 5 parts per million. That's the FDA guidance level for equids and rabbits. So it's sort of a smaller feed segment. And then we only saw 6.7% in the 5 to 9.9 area. So this here again might be some concern for DDG, but our plants, they are testing for this mycotoxin to ensure that it doesn't infect their supply that they ship off to our customers overseas. In comparing versus the harvest report, saw a little bit of a drop in Fumonisin throughout the year as it made its way to export. So in conclusion, for the whole report, 2019-2020 corn exports were on average better than or equal to #1 when it came to test weight, total damage, and then slightly above the maximum standard for #2 when it came to BCFM. That said, we were still able to meet grade on all shipments headed out of the US. Stress cracks and whole kernels were higher and lower than the 5-year average respectively. And the samples were reflective of a growing season not conducive to aflatoxin development due to the intense moisture we had this year. We had a slightly higher prevalence of DON in the 2019-2020 export samples compared to the 2018-19 samples, but still 100% of the samples were lower than 5 parts per million. So no concerns in whole grain exports from the samples that we took when it came to vomitoxin. If you want to look at other things in the report, if you want to look at exactly how we take this data, the analysis methods, some historical perspectives, if you want to look at how we compare growing conditions to the test results, go online to www.grains.org and check out the report. And also you can see the past 9 years of data and really dig into it and see what we're working with. And if you dig into this data, it can be an extremely useful tool for your operation around the world. It's something that takes a lot of effort and time, and it's something that our international customers have given wonderfully positive feedback on and continue to look forward to each and every year. So I just want to thank everyone for tuning in to the U.S. Grains Council's 2019-2020 Export Cargo Quality Report. I'm Reece Cannady with the U.S. Grains Council once again. If you have any questions for us, any comments, anything you'd like to see in the reports going forward, please reach out to us. Again, our website is grains.org. That's grains.org. Thank you very much for tuning in. Have a wonderful year.